I have a pet name for my family, meaning my husband and my son, and I call them the grumbling, bumbling Israelites. Now, no disrespect is intended to the Israelites because we're just like you here in our home, sinners. The reason I call them this is because it seems like they are always whining and complaining when it comes to food. What's for dinner? You know I don't like that. Why can't I have this or that? Sometimes I wish I could just strike a rock and let water flow out and drown the noise. Well, in this weekend's readings, the Israelites are at it again. This is the third time in the desert wanderings that they are whining and complaining since leaving Egypt as slaves. God had freed them and they were headed to the promised land. But on the way, it was hard. Even the essentials were hard. And instead of learning to have faith in God and His provisions and keep moving forward, they longed to go backward into slavery because at least there they knew what to expect. And knowing what to expect is more comfortable than not knowing. But that would require them to trust in a God that was leading them. But God had already showed them how trustworthy He was. He performed one supernatural feat after another, such as the plagues, parting of the Red Sea, making food fall from the sky in the desert. But it wasn't enough, and they started to quarrel and complain against Moses. This time, the issue was there was no water. Had they learned nothing from their earlier provisions God had provided? Although the grumbling seemed to be against Moses, it was ultimately against the Lord, as any grumblings are. Do we complain about our circumstances? Blaming others, co-workers, spouses, kids, parents, the economy? God is the God of all circumstances because God is sovereign. So complaining is always against His ordering of our lives. But Moses had grown accustomed to this and he knew where to turn. He went to God again and God directed him to a rock, telling him to strike it with a staff, which he did, and a stream of water would come flowing out. Another miraculous feat. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 and 4, Paul refers to this rock as a symbol of Christ. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Jewish tradition believed that this rock followed them around the desert as a constant source of refreshment on their march through the desert. What the Israelites rejected or maybe didn't understand, the Samaritan woman finally did. Orthodox Jews traveling from Judea to Galilee would usually take the long route, which was twice as long, just to avoid the contamination of the Samaritans, but not Jesus. He deliberately chose this route because he knew the needs of the Samaritans. How often do we do the same thing and avoid difficult people or the untouchables? Not our Jesus, and not on this hot day. On this day, he sat down, exhausted from his work and travel, in need of a cold drink. A Samaritan woman approached, and Jesus took the initiative to begin the conversation with her and ask her for a drink. This sparked a conversation about living water. To drink the water that Jesus promised to give is to have one's innermost needs so completely and permanently met that it is as though one had an eternal spring at the deepest core of our being. That water that gushed forth out of the rock in the wilderness gushes out for us and satisfies our soul's thirst for faith, hope, and love, which Paul tells us results from God's love when it is poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit in the life-giving waters of baptism. The Samaritan woman accepted these life-giving waters Jesus offered, and she became a believer that day and a missionary by going and telling so many about him that her whole village came. Whereas the Israelites in the desert could not trust and believe God despite all the proof. Their refusal to trust and obey kept them wandering in the desert until their death. So which is it going to be for us in our desert wanderings this Lent? Are we going to whine and complain about the hardships on this road of self-sacrifice as we journey toward the promised land of Easter and therefore decide to turn back to our slavery of sin? Or are we, like the Samaritan woman, going to take the life-giving water of Jesus that He offers us as He follows and walks with us on our journey, giving us refreshment for our soul as we need it on this journey toward Him? This results in us being filled with faith, hope, and love. The world may seem appealing, and the life of the faithful may seem hard, but there is life in the latter and death in the former. I hope this Lent and always you will choose life.